morning, everyone. My name is Beth Ann Turnovan. I'm the Clinical Director here at Family Services Windsor-Essex. On behalf of our Executive Director, Joy Suck, and our entire team here at Family Services Windsor-Essex, along with our esteemed colleague, Jennifer White, we welcome you this morning to another edition of our Coffee with Colleagues. I'm going to mention that we will be recording the event so that you can view it afterwards. The chat will be enabled. We will take questions at the end. Our guest speaker will be speaking until 10 to the hour, at which point in time our Director of Counseling and Mental Health Programs, Kira Holmes, will be taking the questions off the chat and have our speaker address those questions. We begin with our land acknowledgement today. Together, we honor the land that we are on, even though this meeting is taking place virtually. Today, we are all joined from the traditional, ancestral, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, representing the Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. We acknowledge the land and the surrounding waters for sustaining us, and we are committed to protecting and restoring these lands and waters from environmental degradation. I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the land you are currently on and its original peoples. Our topic today, emotion-focused therapy, which is going to be an introduction to theory and process. And now I transfer it over to our colleague Jennifer White to introduce our guest speaker.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm so pleased to introduce Antonio. Antonio Pasquale-Leone is a psychologist and professor in psychology at the University of Windsor, an honorary professor of psychiatry at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. He has published seminal contributions on emotion-focused therapy and is regarded as a world expert in emotion processing. He has co-authored Emotion-Focused Therapy for Complex Trauma. Here, check it out. Handy dandy. And has a forthcoming book on principles of emotion change, which is due to be released in spring of 2025. His work is recognized by career awards from international societies like the Society of Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration and the Society for Psychotherapy Research, as well as distinguished publication awards from associations in the US and Germany. He is a certified trainer in emotion-focused therapy and has given workshops in a dozen countries and received awards for teaching his psychotherapy skills. His TEDx talk on how to get over the end of a relationship has 5.8 million views on YouTube. At least 30 of those are clients of mine who I've referred over. So definitely check it out. And he runs a private practice here in Windsor as well. Antonio, thank you so much for joining us today. We think you're a pretty big deal.
Thank you so much for such a warm introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm just going to dive right in and get things rolling here. Give me a second. Lots of screens to manage here. And that's what we want. Oops, not there. Good idea to start at the beginning, right? So, you can hear me all right? And you see what I see, which is a screen, an intro screen. So, I'm just going to dive right in. I'm so excited to be here. Just a thank you to Windsor Family Services, Windsor-Essex, and also to Jen for introducing me. I think this Coffee with Colleagues is a fantastic initiative. And I'm going to just say something about that, if I can, quickly, right? So, like, think of this as a very quick, I see there are a lot of people here, which is wonderful. And so I know you know why you're here, but I'm going to be a bit cheeky. So just a quick aside, in case you weren't sure why you're here, right? I mean, it's interesting, yeah. But, this is from the University of Windsor. We have an outpatient mental health clinic. If you go, I don't want to freak anybody out. This kind of research is not very popular. But, most therapists think they're average, but the truth is you can actually rank therapists based on, these are the outcomes of their patients. If you have 5 to 11 clients, and then there's some therapists are fantastic and some therapists are not so great. Passing that red line means you're making a big difference for your client. Passing the second red line means you're fantastic, right? So this is our clinic, right? It was super confidential. Nobody knew who anybody was and all of that. My point is, some therapists are better than others. That's the truth, right? And it doesn't actually matter which approach you're using. And then you might say, well, these are, University of Windsor students, and so people get better with experience, right? And I think I'm just showing you, this isn't even on emotion-focused therapy, but I'm just showing you, what people need to know, therapists need to think about is, do you get better just with experience? And the reality is, people tend to see the same clients over and over again, or just work the same way they have, right? And there's some studies, so this is a study that's looked at therapists, and again, sort of looking at the outcomes of their clients and looking at therapists over time. So who's getting better? Look at this person over 5, 7 years, this person's spectacularly getting better and better every year. But most people are actually staying pretty much the same. This is up to 18 years, right? So do therapists improve over time? Not reliably. Not reliably. So what do you do? How do you become a better therapist, right? Because you could be one of these there, you could be this person, right? And the answer is deliberate practice. So even though people are trained professionals, they tend to be as good as they were when they first graduated. There's a steep learning curve. And then after that, most people plateau in their careers in terms of how good they are as therapists, unless they engage in some sort of deliberate practice. And there are 2 domains: skills and knowledge, right? Today, we're talking mostly about knowledge. Like, what can I tell you that might help you become a better therapist? All right. So, so that's part of what this is, I think, the Coffee with Colleagues. And so you can pat yourself on the back because you're on your way to being one of these people. I also think we have a lot of resources in Windsor, and there's no reason why, I've said this to Jen and others, there's no reason why we can't in Windsor have a better quality therapy than on average than, say, in Toronto. Or, I mean, we have a lot of intensive resources, and so this is one way of using them. All right, back to your regular scheduled programming. I'm going to tell you a little bit about emotion-focused therapy, and the idea here is to introduce some ideas. If you haven't seen this before, if you aren't familiar with this approach to therapy, how does it work? What does it look like? We know that CBT is the most popular approach to therapy in terms of what people are using. We know that in reality, most of us are using integrative approaches. That's true around the world. And we know that there's lots of ways to put things together. So I'm going to introduce some perhaps new ideas to you and try to give you some practical tips, even in the next 50 minutes. So let me just talk about emotion a little bit, because one of the big pieces of emotion-focused therapy is a different way of looking at emotion. It's not just, and it's easy to think of emotion, painful emotion, as the symptoms. But here we're thinking about it more. Some of the emotions are symptoms, and some of them are the process of working through something, okay? So a key idea is that emotion isn't just a label for an experience or a bad experience, but that's a network of information, right? So this is the idea of an emotion structure or emotion scheme. And also that discrete emotions have they're associated with particular kinds of information that can guide adaptive functioning. So that emotion out of the box is actually adaptive, okay? And then people learn stuff that isn't good for them, right? You have maladaptive emotions as the result of trauma or other kinds of learning where, we'll talk about that in a second. So then a key idea in terms of application in emotion-focused therapy is the idea of markers. I remember I've been trained in a number of approaches to therapy, but, I remember doing, say, group therapy, CBT group therapy for panic disorder. And it was like a classroom, right? We had like week 1, we're doing this, week 2, we're doing this, me flipping the manual, right? And it's like, I could tell you what we're doing in week 4, even though it's a couple of weeks away, because it's highly structured like a classroom sort of. In emotion-focused therapy, it doesn't quite work that way. The interventions are marker-based. If the client does this in the session, then you do that. But if they do this other thing, then you go to plan B, right? So there are these if-then markers, and those markers could be things the client says, unfinished business about some baggage, the interpersonal baggage the client has with somebody, and it's hot and it's alive, we will introduce a certain kind of intervention. Or some of the times those markers are specific kinds of emotions. And the goal, I think I'm going to contrast with cognitive behavioral therapy, which is familiar with a lot of people. If the goal of cognitive behavioral therapy is really like Podesky's book, Mind Over Mood, right? It's to use your thoughts to reframe and change how you feel about stuff. Well, to reframe your thinking, which then would change how you feel about it. So using thinking to change your feelings. And that works in certain contexts. Of course, in other contexts, it works less well, particularly for highly maladaptive emotions. And Greenberg introduced this idea of, which is central to emotion-focused therapy, of changing emotion with another emotion. So we're talking about competing emotions, and one emotion might actually be the antidote to another. So now you're seeing a little bit that when I'm working in session with a client, we're going to be trying to stoke certain kinds of emotional experiences. You can think of so when I'm teaching emotion-focused therapy or just training people in therapy skills in general, you can think of, clients come in and they have an external narrative. There's the story. This is the plot and characters. And you really have to, as a therapist, so I'm trying to give you, here's just a little practical tip. Is this plot and characters, right? It usually comes with an external voice, an external vocal quality, right? So that's something that's been used in process research. That's like this. This is my lecture voice. This is the voice I give when I know exactly what I'm going to say. It's very rhythmic. You always know the sentence is going to end, and people use loudness to create emphasis. So when your client's talking like that, that's the external plot and characters. It's rehearsed. They've done this before, okay? That's not new content. It's not a great use of your time or the client's time. Sometimes you have to get some context of what happened. But there are other times when clients are going to, I'll call it an internal narrative, right? The personal feelings and their thoughts about the story. And they might slow down. So I'm listening to their voice and they slow down. And it's hard to kind of know when the sentence is going to end. And instead of using loudness, when people are using this focused vocal quality, they'll use pitch for emphasis. That's a focused vocal quality. When clients are talking like that, so I haven't even talked about the content, but when clients are sounding like that, slow down, don't interrupt. This is newly emerging content, right? And so I'm going to change my interventions based on these kind of external plot and characters versus which is the told story, right? Versus this internal reflexive narrative, which is the lived story. This is where people make meaning, okay? So first, I'm giving you something as a therapist, just sort of orient to where do we need to be right now. And I'm dipping back and forth. If you said to me, okay, well, what are emotions? I would say an emotion is a very densely packaged unit of information. That's what it is, right? They're evolutionarily derived. And the first thing emotion does is orient you to stimuli, right? We've all had this experience where you're upset about something, but you have something you need to do at work. And yet it's like a tractor beam. It pulls your attention to attend to those other things that are upsetting, right? So this is part of what emotion does in general. But the other thing it does is it organizes you for action. So it's a densely packaged unit of information. What I mean by that, it's implicit, right? So your body starts to organize. The hair goes up on the back of your neck, your eyes dilate you, and all of these things sort of happen without you necessarily even knowing that you're being organized a certain way. Emotion is much older than rational high cognition, right? And so part of the thing that happens is these happen outside of awareness. So you're organized a certain way. part of the puzzle for the therapist then is to figure out, how is my client organized, and how can we talk about that or bring that to light so that becomes part of the conversation in the therapy session, right? Rather than just being organized a certain way defensively or what. How can we bring that, make the unconscious conscious? But this is a nuance with respect to emotion in particular, right? What's the meaning that's embedded in this client organizing this way? More about emotion. There are different kinds of emotion. So in an emotion-focused approach, we would focus on, try to think about, the most obvious is instrumental emotion. I won't spend a lot of time on that. Instrumental emotion is, when people are using emotion as a socially manipulative tool, right? Crying crocodile tears, or getting really angry in a meeting because it also gets results, okay? So that's a little bit more deliberate. There are ways to work with that. We won't talk about so much here today. I'll focus a little bit more on primary versus secondary emotion. And I'm going to move up. So secondary emotion tends to be the symptoms. Emotion is a symptom, right? So this is anxiety. This is feeling helpless, feeling hopeless, right? And underneath that, there's a deeper process. We'll call that primary emotion, right? Of course, there are two kinds of primary emotion. One is biologically adaptive, right? Talk about that in a second. And the other is maladaptive. These are learned. These are learned through life. So, you can think of emotion and the discrete emotions you have as things that are organizing you a certain way in certain situations, and they come in the box. I'm imagining the hardware. It comes with the hardware. You're born with this, you develop. And of course, there are other times when these sort of emotions get developed in certain situations. I was making reference to traumatic situations, for example, where they're less adaptive. But let's just think about, how are these emotions adapted? And I'm reminding you of things that you already know. If you think of anger, I'll just do a couple of them, right? If you think of anger, well, people get angry at violation, attack on the family, on their possessions or whatever. And this is useful because it organizes you, right? It organizes you to assert, to protect, to defend. What I'm going to point out to you, say, of course. And what I want to point out to you is, when people are organized that way, they don't always have a very clear idea of what they're fighting for, but they have a sense that they need to fight. Yeah? And so it's unpacking that nuance of meaning that is going to help bring clients to the next level or make use of those emotions. Sadness, loss, separation, this sort of thing. And here people are seeking support, right? A baby cries out for help. Fear, obviously organized in situations of danger. You can think of something like shame. Even shame is biologically adaptive. There's adaptive shame and maladaptive shame. What's adaptive shame? Well, if you think of a situation where somebody has, let me give you an example, right? You have a little kid, grade 1, and he's sitting at the back of the class, and he pees himself a little bit, and he feels very ashamed, embarrassed, right? Is that healthy or unhealthy? We all feel bad for that kid, right? But it's actually healthy, right? It's a painful experience, but it's healthy because it's really hard to keep your friends if you smell like urine. So, shame is about hiding. You feel ashamed when you've acted inappropriately, and shame that the action tendencies. So a lot of this is going to be discovered in the action tendencies. You're trying to hide or correct an impropriety that protects your social standing, right? And we could go through other emotions and sort of look at, when are they adaptive? And here they are. Of course, some emotions, as I keep saying, could be maladaptive. And, you could really have a maladaptive version of any of these. I'll just highlight, right? Sadness. Clearly, sadness is, when it's adaptive, it's grieving, it's reaching out. And when it's maladaptive, there's this sense of desperate clinging or the hopeless despair, right? Anger is another example, empowering versus destructive anger. And shame, we're just sort of talking about those examples, showing remorse. You do see adaptive shame in some examples. in therapy. Usually in therapy, you see maladaptive shame, but I could give you several scenarios. The most obvious, though, is going to be in couples therapy. If you are in a couple and you're in couples therapy and you want to keep that relationship and you have violated the values of that relationship, you feel ashamed. I'm sorry. I feel embarrassed that I did that to you, or right, some betrayal, for example, right? This is adaptive. This is healthy in terms of it protects the social standing in the relationship. So I'm trying to highlight these examples, right? Of course, the therapist's job or puzzle is on an ongoing basis is trying to triage, is this adaptive or is this maladaptive emotion? So that's the first piece. Those are the pieces that move. Then we have different ways of working with emotion. So I'll just give you two. One is, when you have adaptive emotion, two big problems that people present in therapy and that emotion-focused therapy really tries to highlight. One is when you have adaptive emotion, but it gets interrupted. For whatever reason, it's too painful and the client doesn't go there. This is healthy grieving that's too painful for this client to actually do. This is standing up for myself and getting angry when this is healthy assertion. We all know people, if not clients, but certainly we probably know clients who have trouble asserting themselves appropriately, right? And when they do, they might fly off the handle and they no longer know what they're fighting for, okay? So the solution here is to allow and complete the emotional experience. All one really needs, all as if it were so easy, is to work on awareness and then expression of adaptive emotions. I won't get into this a lot because we're trying to, just give you tasters here, but this is research by Michael Bridges. It's very simple. I mean, this has been done with fMRIs and all sorts of stuff, but I like this because it's just simple. What he's got is a heart rate monitor. He's got a heart rate monitor on the client, right? And they're working along, and suddenly there's this spike in arousal. One of the things for therapists that I would want therapists to know is, therapists often are quite ambivalent about emotional expression in the client because the concern is, well, what if it goes keeps going off the deep end sort of thing. And so this spike in heart rate, which is high, if you look at the videos, high emotional arousal, is really distressing. What you could look at the video, what happened is distressing. It's alarming sometimes for some therapists, right? But I'm going to show you a contrasting example. This is not something you have to worry about. The client experiences high arousal, it's adaptive, and the therapist actually stays with the emotion, stay with the client, helps them symbolize what's going on, the emerging experience, right? I think the client says it's rocked my whole sense of who I am, and therapist goes there and they explore that. And the interesting thing is, yeah, they have the client has an intense emotional experience, but they recover, cardiovascular recovery, right? 5 minutes later. In a different example, very, very similar, I won't get into details, a different example, this different therapist though, same thing, chugging along, and then you get a very similar spike. If I drew a line here, you wouldn't, right? You wouldn't really know that there's a long-term recovery instead of the quick. So what actually happens is there's a long-term return to baseline. And what you see here is the client, this is the example, the client says, really shaking my sense of self or whatever. And the therapist, if you go to the video, for whatever reason, the therapist doesn't direct the client to stay with her feeling. Maybe the therapist gets a bit nervous about the intense arousal and sort of goes to context, family. So who was there? Uncle so-and-so at the family reunion. Directs the client to plot and characters. So, and then clients are very obliging. Clients want therapy to work even more than you do. And so they're trying to accommodate you, right? They also see you at whether they see you as an authority, whether you want that or not. They see you, they've come to see you for help, right? And so the client obliges, therapist changes topic to plot and characters, and the client follows. And so if you watch the video, what you see is a client who doesn't look upset at all and says, yeah, well, okay, sorry. Yeah, Uncle so-and-so, and then tells this plot and character story. Of course, all the while, her heart is pounding, right? And there's a very slow recovery that the therapist isn't aware of, because this, the therapist is basically taking it off the table. We're not talking about the feeling that's happening in the moment. We're talking about something else. It's very possible that that therapist goes, disaster averted, right? I've changed the topic. The client's not upset. But if we looked at the heart rate, we know the client is upset and actually takes a much longer time to recover than if you had gone there. So this is an example, right? Engaging adaptive emotion, completing that experience is a healthy process, one of the healthy processes. When emotion is maladaptive, it's a different problem, right? Because you can't complete the experience of maladaptive shame. The person says, I don't feel like I'm a member of the human race, is something a client once said to me, right? In the trauma book. That's not an experience you can engage and make meaning of and complete, right? That somehow we're going to have to change that. So it's transforming that. How do you change that, right? I mean, one of the puzzles is, obviously you are a member of the human race. See, cognitive arguments aren't going to work here, right? See, you are human. The person, they don't feel human. Huh? So this is where the changing emotion with emotion becomes a different way of working through this. So maladaptive emotions, like say fear, that would be maladaptive fear, right? Traumatic fear, shame of being unworthy, unlovable, unacceptable, can actually be transformed with assertive anger or other emotions. Here is this maladaptive emotion, right? And you have this experience. The thing is, nobody's feeling just one thing. So when that client feels ashamed, for example, there's also this little glimmers of other experiences, right? If you use subjective units of distress, right? The behavioral, it's like, it's falsely unidimensional. There's other things going on. And actually this client also feels a little bit of anger. They don't quite know. My one client talking about how she was neglected and mistreated in her family. At one point she says, it's not fair. And she gives the table a little kick. She doesn't feel angry, but she feels a sense of injustice. She's not aware that she feels angry. Maybe we can think of it that way, right? And so I bring her attention to that, right? There's a sense of being at the bottom of the barrel and something about it not being fair. She says, yeah, and there's a little punch there. And I bring attention to that, and that brings this other emotion online. And now we're feeling both feelings, okay? You do this over time, and what happens is you generate some sort of synthesis. Hebb, Canadian neuroscientist, who's often quoted as saying, neurons that fire together wire together. Neurons that fire together wire together, right? So the cues of this maladaptive shame, if you can get it to fire at the same time with a new response, which is something assertive, it's not fair, I deserve to be treated properly, so and so, is maybe compassion toward the self, that brings it online. And then the cues of what were shame now also in this new synthesis over time start to also cue a sense of entitlement, healthy entitlement, right? And so we're creating, this is a different kind of change process. This is changing one emotion with another emotion, okay? And we generate some change over time. Speaking of time, I'm just peeking here. So let me just skip ahead past this. There are patterns in emotion. If I'm jumping to the stuff, all of it's interesting. But we'll give a big workshop some other time. Here, I'm trying to give you, how is this relevant to you, right? Here's a study. This is a study that looked at vulnerability. So one way of doing psychotherapy research, one of the methods is that, yeah, there are videos of therapy, but you could actually, researcher, go interview the client right after the session or within 24 hours. And you're the researcher, not the therapist, and you watch the video with the client and you say, what's happening here? What's going on there? And I see you close your eyes and what do you feel? And see, it's a different level of processing of what happened. Of course, that becomes now research data. And so this study was looking at when clients express vulnerability. what happens next? See, what happens next is you can do one of two things if you're the therapist. You can either approach, client is vulnerable, and you go, hey, what's going on? And you approach that. What do I mean vulnerability? Have you ever seen a client well up, right? Did you comment on it? Did you ask them what's going on? Or did you just kind of wait for them to bring it up and then they don't? You know what I'm talking about, right? You bring it up 10 minutes later, they're like, yeah, I don't know what you're. So you approach or you withdraw. Withdraw would be changing the topic, right? Let's go to plot. Tell me about the plot and care, right? Or doing nothing. So waiting it out is experienced by the client as a withdrawal. Okay. So like if you give the clients vulnerable, you give them a lot of room, give them a lot of time. You know, the thing is you have to think these are humans just like you. When you're on the street corner talking to not a close friend, but an associate, and your client gets emotional, your friend, colleague gets emotional, and they kind of hold their breath a little bit and they look up at the street light and they don't seem like they want to go there. So you don't go there, and then they kind of recover. And then they talk about the ball game or whatever, and they change. See what happened there? I mean, the social norm is you don't bring it out and make people cry on the street corner. So these people come in, and if you withdraw, if you don't comment on it, they have a reaction. It's experiences with withdraw. So client is vulnerable. Therapist either withdraws or approach. And if you ask clients, what's happening now? If the client did nothing or changed topic, if the therapist did nothing or changed topic, the client feels ashamed and closes down, right? I mean, they don't necessarily say that. And of course, if you approach, they explore further. What's going on? And you've seen this before, right? Vulnerability, an approach, and then the person really cries, right? And that leads to more reflexive internal narrative. And you get this is a very productive loop. It's very painful, but you develop a lot of meaning here. Vulnerability, withdraw. The person feels ashamed. They don't tell you because that would be more vulnerability. Instead, they go to an external narrative. This is a window in time, though. Here it is. There it is. There's the vulnerability. Oh, you missed it, right? And if you bring it up 10 minutes later and you say, I noticed like 5 minutes ago, you seemed like emotional. What was going on? And they don't remember. They're like, yeah, no, I don't remember. So you have to strike while the iron is hot. You gotta just acknowledging it, saying, and this affects you. I can see this really stirs thing up for you. That's enough. That's enough. And you put it on the table. Now it's something we're going to talk about, right? What do you say? Sometimes I get therapists saying, yeah, but if you're working with emotion, like what do you actually say to the client? Well, okay, they have a feeling. I'll give you some talking points, right? I mean, there's always an interpersonal context or situation, right? But there's an action tendency. What does the feeling make you want to do? Sometimes people are just talking about what they want to do, and it's not related to a context. Well, then these are different talking points, right? There's a somatic experience. What's happening inside? It's like I have this knot in my belly or butterflies in my stomach or so on and so forth, right? There's a concern for the self. When people feel stuff, it's because it means something to them. Nobody gets upset about stuff that isn't important. It's important. And then your job is to figure out why. You might pull out the somatic experience, elaborate on the action tendencies. And I'm going to say, most importantly, there's an underlying interpersonal or existential need, right? I was talking about anger, and sometimes people forget about what they're fighting for. What do you need? What are you defending? If somebody's sad, what are you grieving? What would it say on the tombstone that you are grieving? It would say, like, what is the loss? I don't know. I just feel overwhelmed and sad. Okay, then we're not there yet, right? And we have to start exploring. I'm giving you talking points there. These are the things you would explore to help focus the client. Yes, they'll get upset. Don't get too nervous, right? And we'll work through it. So, part of the thing is identifying whether these are adaptive or maladaptive emotions. Secondary emotions, which is kind of more global distress, defensive emotions, anger, that sort of thing, rage. Here's some research. I'm trying to, I don't know if it's unappealing for me to use the word research, right? But I'm trying to point out, this is stuff we know. If you track emotions, people feel different things, and it turns out that when it's not productive, they go in circles. Anybody know what I'm talking about? When it is productive, there's kind of a progression. They move from one state to another. When people are very upset, and this is high distress, but low meaning. I'm so upset and I don't know why, says the client, right? They start there. If you stay with that feeling and help them elaborate what's going on, there's often a maladaptive emotion there, some underlying fear or shame. There might be some vague, kind of general rejecting anger, like destructive anger. But underneath the fear or shame, there's an unmet need, right? And there's also this negative self-valuation. Think of a core dysfunctional belief. And working through those, right, especially identifying the unmet need, brings you to down here, these more adaptive emotions with assertive anger, self-compassion, grief, hurt, right? These are adaptive emotions. Of course, you have to work through this process. Knowing a bit about this process helps therapists quite a lot. Let me show you something. Here's global distress. Here's assertive anger. That's not very helpful. This is very helpful. If I turn it upside down, here we go, right? So now higher up is more productive, all right? So we could watch the videotape of you and the client and code it and be like, what emotional state is the client going in? And of course, it's very messy. Have you ever had this experience? Usually people are sort of make some progress and then they seem to kind of collapse and then they seem move forward and then sort of collapse, right? Where you've been working with a client and you go, yeah, yes, yes. Oh, this is good. This is helpful. Yes, yes, yeah. No. And the client seems to sort of unravel or lose the specificity of what was useful, right? And they go, well, maybe it was my fault, says the client. There's kind of this little collapse, right? That doesn't mean you therapists were doing a bad job, right? Because it doesn't work that way. It's not climbing up a ladder. It works more like this. So this is us coding this client, and this sort of clients make some progress, and then they have a little collapse, and it makes more progress, a little collapse, and then and over again, right? And over time, you get this kind of gradual increase, but it's like the sea coming in, right? Like the tide coming in. There's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Each one of these is like an emotional push-up. Remember, I was talking about, as an example, it's not always anger, but assertive anger as an antidote to maladaptive shame. This is that, right? And then they collapse. Well, maybe it was my fault, but maybe it wasn't. And that's 2 push-ups. That's 3 push-ups. These are like emotional push-ups. And of course, every time they do it, they spend less and less time in this maladaptive state. So if the therapist has a framework where they know I'm going to keep, this is going to happen, but that I'm keeping my trajectory, right? Bringing the client back to the pieces that seem useful, right? Not interrupting the client, but moving them through it. Enough about emotion, right? I do want to show you some snapshots of therapy, of intervention. Some of the, I've been talking about, the working with the client and listening and responding to the narrative or the underlying feeling, and how to, right, not miss the window of opportunity there. Vocal quality, focus vocal quality versus the plot and character's external vocal quality. EFT also has these tasks, right? Which are also, there's the big markers for these. The tasks are things like this, kind of a self-evaluative split. This is self-criticism, right? You do 2-chair dialogue. I'll explain the first one and skip over and explain the third one. This is a self-critical split where I imagine talking to myself. If I'm the client, right? If I'm the therapist, I have you talk to a version of yourself, right? It's like a dialogue with myself. Or the unfinished business dialogue, right? Which is imagining, it's an imaginal confrontation. I imagine a significant other, right? The marker is unfinished business, lingering bad feelings towards somebody. It's like, I never got over the betrayal of X, right? Of so-and-so, or that my parents, whatever they did, right? These grievances, these long-standing unresolved grievances, you would have an imaginary conversation. Imagine the person in the chair and have a conversation. Notice the idea of a dialogue is tied to the fact, In therapy, we haven't talked a lot about the relationship. Some people know something about that, but there's a connection. Then we're evoking emotion. Yes, deliberately. So these interventions are quite evocative. And then accessing a deeper emotion. And what's going to happen is there's going to be generally a maladaptive emotion, which you're going to try to transform or change. And there's also going to be, remember I said nobody feels just one thing. There's also going to be an adaptive emotion, which you're going to use as a guide to kind of organize the. This is the antidote to that. This plays out, though, in terms of the person's issues. If you're talking about self-criticism, well, we know, well, self-criticism is a thing. This can look a little bit like evidence against from a CBT perspective. So a key idea here is that in emotion-focused therapy, the fundamental question is not about self-critical process. It isn't about truth. I feel like a loser, says the client. And CBT, a cognitive approach, goes to, is that true or not? Is the criticism true or not, right? What is the evidence of whether, and basically, not to turn it into a blunt instrument, but I'm going to try to convince the client that maybe they're not a loser based on that would be a more balanced belief that I've had successes. And all right. EFT takes quite a different approach. The question of whether it's true is irrelevant in emotion-focused approach. What we are interested in is, client says, I think I'm a loser, is enacting that. Tell him you're such a loser and tell him why, right? What does it do to you to be on the receiving end of a criticism like that? What does it feel like? It's not, is it true? It's what's the impact of this criticism? So here you're ending up with what kind of maladaptive emotion does it evoke? What kind of assertion does it evoke? What kind of compassion towards self might it evoke a few steps from now? You with me? When we go to things, I would give you other examples, but I was just sort of saying, oops, I forgot the example that we used, right? The example of, I'm not a member of the human race. It's like, I think the person knows that this is not true, but it feels true, right? I was working with somebody who said, and they're also in the trauma book as a case study, but the client says, I feel like an imposter. I feel like I'm always the dumb one in the room. And she says, I have a PhD, and yet I always feel like it was an accident that I ended up got through the program, or right. I mean, the evidence is pretty clear what's true. The problem is it doesn't feel true, right? So instead of working on whether it's true or not, to work through a maladaptive emotion, we're going to be looking at what is the process? What does it do to you to be treated that way, which creates, this weak, bad, unworthy self, evokes a reaction, right? Which is more adaptive reaction. Again, emotion organizing you in a certain way. So the self-critical tasks, for example, here it is kind of mapped out. And how do you end up with all these boxes? You do a lot of research. So the process has been studied quite a lot. And here you have, the marker, the person says, I feel like a piece of garbage. And you'll actually get them to enact it. 2 chairs. So the first chair, Fritz Perls talked about the self-critical chair, the hot seat, the top, right? And then there's kind of the experiencing chair. So on this side, you will enact the criticism, be the critic. And on this chair, they'll sort of be, what does it feel like to be treated that way? People will often start with secondary emotions, move to more maladaptive emotions. And eventually, as they start talking about what they want and what they need, they'll respond with more adaptive emotions. So let's see if this video works here. I'll give you an example of how it gets set up. You might just get the sound. Let's see.
Trying to tell myself that I didn't know any better at the time, and I keep trying to forgive myself.
Yes.
But it's not working.
Yeah, I can hear that somehow. I mean, because I guess that is important, to forgive yourself and to sort of come to terms with it. But somehow that doesn't
Huh. I'm noticing the video's not quite playing. I could, I'm going to jump to a different solution. Yeah. Where's my, oh, stop sharing. I'm going to share a different screen here and we'll see if we can get this going. Because you want to see it, right? Yes. Yeah. Let's try it like this.
That was caused to you, to your son, to having gotten involved.
Exactly.
So somehow you chastise yourself.
So notice what he's going to do is tease apart the two sides and then set up a dialogue. We won't watch it unfold, but just watch him set it up.
Right? Like you shouldn't have gotten married to him.
And at times I think that I've come to terms with that. But apparently I haven't.
Because you just feel so much pain about it or so. And then what happens? What does it make you feel when you blame yourself? I mean,
Well, it makes me feel terrible.
yeah.
And I keep...
Like I'm and you keep, yeah?
I keep trying to tell myself that I didn't know any better at the time, and I keep trying to forgive myself.
Yes, yes.
But it's not working.
Yeah, I can hear that somehow, I mean, because I guess that is important to forgive yourself and to sort of come to terms with it, but somehow that doesn't happen, right? You keep blaming yourself, essentially, yeah? Yeah. You know, I wonder, I don't know if coming in here you were told that sometimes I work with a dialogue between you and a part of yourself, and I wonder if you'd be willing to try this and I'll help you through it, because, you know, it sounds so much like there's a part of you that's condemning yourself and that you struggle with that and it causes such pain. Are you willing to try to do that?
Sure.
Right. So what I'm going to do is suggest that we actually have a dialogue. You stay there. And can you imagine yourself over here and see if you can actually maybe get an image or a picture? And this is the self that you chastise or blame, right? And this is the part of you that's unforgiving and blaming, right? We're going to actually try to set up a dialogue, right? Because I think this is the source of a lot of pain in you, right? Okay. So, what do you say to her? It's like you should never have...
And here you're kind of enacting. We're just going to take 2 minutes more, but we're sort of enacting the critical part that usually isn't explicitly voiced, right?
Married him, or you should have noticed the signs. Let's do it. Actually, say it to her.
You should have you should have known better than to get involved with him in the first place, because there were all those signs and he didn't treat you well while you were going out with him in the first place.
Tell her what the signs were or what she should have paid attention to.
So specificity is very important when you're working with emotion, right?
You should have paid attention to the fact that he was late all the time, that he went out to the bars all the time and left you sitting at home and would lie to you. And the first time he hit you, you should have... You should have just left him and walked away from him then. And you're stupid because you didn't do it.
Yeah, so this is it. You're stupid, right? Tell her again, this is where...
So This is an example of, right? And you can see they start with more general kind of criticisms and moves to something much more specific. So I'm just going to jump back here for a moment. We're going to take 1 minute here, and there are other tasks and so forth. This is a case, right? A case illustration. We won't go through it in detail, but this is, the woman is a nurse, was very neglected. This is the client who I was saying, it's not fair. And she kind of gives the table a little kick. This is that client, right? She was her mother dies of cancer, and then her father, probably in his grief, starts to drink himself to death. And she lives through that as kind of a passive observer, but also as a very neglected child, right? She tells stories about kind of making dinner, which is making peanut butter sandwiches, and the father drunk, shuffling through the kitchen, picking a sandwich and keep walking and ignoring her, right? And her sense is somehow it was my fault, something about me. And so, I'm bringing back to this, and I'm just highlighting, this is like, what one is doing in terms of case formulation is kind of noticing, yes, she gets very upset. She goes to this sense of shame, and it's something about me. This is the secondary emotion, maladaptive emotion. And a case formulation approach then starts to look at, how do I get to my next slide, is, what are the unmet needs? The green are, this is where I need to go, right? To help the client unpack unmet needs. This is the treatment focus. Assertion, self-compassion, that becomes part of the resolution, okay? So I'm just trying to highlight, this is a different way of working, perhaps, from what you're most familiar with, and how to transform maladaptive shame using other emotions in a deliberate process. So I hope this gives you something different to do, or to try. I want to thank you for your time, and maybe we have some time for questions. That's that. Cheers.
Thank you. We do have one question that's come into the chat box, and Beth Ann did add a little reminder in the chat box that if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in there. So Dr. Antonio, the first question that we have is actually from Mark. Mark, it's nice to see you. He's asking, clients often will ask in therapy, how do I get rid of these feelings? How do I explain to them simply that delving into those bad feelings might be a precondition for feeling better or healing? I particularly find it challenging when clients come in asking for tips or techniques on how to feel better.
I think it's a good question, right? And part of, the question you could put in a larger rubric, which is, how do you give a rationale to clients for working a certain way, right? And this isn't so unique to an emotion-focused approach. Think of behavior therapy. Exposure-based therapies work quite well for certain kinds of problems. They tend to be best at reducing secondary emotion. But anyway, you better have, if I have a phobia of dogs, and your idea is I should spend time with dogs, I'm going to be like, I'm not sure if you understood that I have a phobia with dogs. Right? Like, you better have a good explanation for why I should walk your dog. Right? And I think the rationale we give clients is some explanation on how exposure therapy works. Okay. So this is not so unique to emotion-focused approach. When you go to an emotion-focused approach, there's going to have to be a rationale that you give to clients about emotion. Okay. About what is emotion is like the first part of the lecture that they gave you, right? And it could be in those terms or not. What is emotion? Why might this be useful? And to what end, right? How can this actually, what are we trying to do here? So just jumping in, which is, I think, older experiential approaches with Fritz Perls or Moreno, or right. This is like, without an explanation, let's just have an experience. You just don't get buy-in. Why would I do that? And it's a pretty good question. So you need a pretty good answer. But the answer is convincing the client of how this might be useful, explaining to them that emotion can be useful. It can be maladaptive, that some emotions might be antidotes to other emotions. And acknowledging also to the client that there's a time and a place. I had a client that came in with social anxiety, and she was a teacher. She didn't have any life, right? She just stayed at home all the time, living with her mother, although she was a grown woman. And I said, look, because also part of the goal is to just make her more functional. And I said, look, there are two really well empirically established ways of working with this. One is an exposure-based approach. It looks like this. And the other is actually to work on what's driving the social anxiety, which turns out to be self-criticism. A lot of good research. So the self-critical process I'm talking about, that social anxiety isn't really an anxiety disorder. It's a shame disorder, right? So I say, look, these are the two ways we could work. We could do a bit of both. I'm practical, right? If it gets you out of the house, then let's do a bit of both. But, what do you want to do? Because we could be managing, which is what behavior exposure is for, and manages symptoms, although then once they're managed, other things happen. Or we could also be working on the deeper process. And I think there's some clients who aren't ready to work on the deeper process. What they need is Band-Aids. That's not a bad thing. A Band-Aid is a useful thing, right? I just need to get out of the house. All right, it's not time to work on the deeper process, right? So introducing that and letting the client choose, I think, is useful, right? If you just want tips to calm down, we could do that. It's always going to haunt you, right? But maybe right now just need tips to calm down. And over the course of therapy, you're probably going to end up doing both, okay?
Thank you, Dr. Antonio. We do have a couple more questions, and I do want to be, cognizant of everyone's time. So hopefully you can stay with us and you don't have a 10 a.m. client. We're going to get through those questions, and then we have a quick little announcement at the end that actually might answer one of these questions. So the next one comes from Marie. Some clients say they don't know how they feel or don't feel anything. Any suggestions on how to guide them?
Absolutely. So one of the interventions that we talk about is a self-interruptive split, right? There's a couple of reasons why people might not feel stuff. One is because they don't think their emotions are important. They grew up in a household, for example, local culture, right, where that's not something we talk about. That's not a thing. And therapists, I'll give you two tips. Therapists expressing a lot of curiosity. Oh, and what's the clients start to sort of, oh, you mean like what's happening in here? Oh, I didn't know that was in. Oh, they start to tend to themselves because you're attending to them. So you are a giant flashlight, and you can point it at a certain thing, right? The other thing is kind of similar to a self-critical split. People sometimes stop themselves from feeling, and then the conversation isn't, well, just feel it for a second. That doesn't work. What's so important about stopping yourself from going there, right? I try not to feel anything because it's too scary, because it's right. And how do you do that? How do you threaten yourself? How do you, people that clench their jaw, do that, you get them to enact that becomes a way of entering into. So a lot of this therapy is very present focused. It's not do the thing that would happen if you weren't doing this right now. Rather, the attention is right now, it seems like you're interrupting yourself or biting your lip. Can we talk about that? Mm-hmm. These are things that we'll talk about in a workshop that I think is going to happen in November. Yeah.
Yeah, so that actually leads into the next question on recommendations for further training sources. And Dr. Antonio is actually going to be a part of our Family Services Institute in the fall, where he will deliver emotion-focused therapy over the course of 2 different weekends. We will be sending out some information for folks to get registered. You're definitely going to want to sign up right away, because it will be a small, intimate group, so that it can be as beneficial as possible to those who are taking the training. But the last question actually speaks a little bit to working with children or youth with EFT. Is there any recommendations on resources, books, tools?
Absolutely. There are a couple of books now on emotion-focused family therapy and emotion-focused therapy for youth. The processes that we're talking about, deepening experience, generating meaning, they've been supported in working with adolescents and working with young people. So there are books you can search, right? Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for everyone for sticking through. I know we lost some of the crowd, but it is recorded. So hopefully they'll jump on to see some of the questions that were answered. It is 10:04, and I think obviously we can't end without a big thank you to Dr. Antonio for taking us through that intriguing 1 hour coffee with colleagues session this morning. We appreciate your time, your knowledge, your expertise that you've shared with us, and we can't wait to hear more at the workshop. So.
Thank you so much. It'll be a lot of fun. The workshop we're going to do, we'll have a lot of video of therapies, and we'll also involve us actually practicing for small groups and actually working to get. So the goal for me isn't for you to just learn stuff, but for you to develop skills.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Dr. Antonio, and thank you for all of you for joining us this morning. It's been a while since we've been delivering the coffee with colleagues, so we're happy to see some folks come back to it. So, all right, everyone, have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Take
Bye-bye,
care.
everybody. Hope to see you soon.